The estate sale occupied 3 floors of a Georgian townhouse near Russell Square. Most visitors moved quickly past the usual accumulation: porcelain figurines, tarnished silverware, boxes of correspondence no one would ever read. But in a corner of the second-floor library, beneath a stack of Victorian novels, a private collector named Martin Hendricks found something that should not have existed. The atlas measured roughly 18 inches by 24 inches, bound in cracked leather with brass corner clasps. The title page read, Atlas Nouveau, and bore the date 1756. Hendricks had seen hundreds of historical maps. He knew the patterns of cartographic error, the artistic liberties, the blank spaces where knowledge ended. This was different. When he opened to the page showing Asia, his hands went still. There, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, lay an empire labeled in elegant script, Tartary in the French edition, Great Tartary in the margins. The borders were precisely drawn. Cities were marked with symbols indicating population centers. Trade routes crossed the territory in red ink. In the southern region, near what modern maps call Kazakhstan, a single city was marked larger than the others, with a notation too faded to read completely. A capital. Hendricks lifted the atlas closer to the window light. The cartographer had not treated this as unknown territory. There were no decorative sea monsters or speculative illustrations filling empty space. The map showed what appeared to be documented geography: rivers, mountain ranges, settlements positioned with the confidence of surveyed knowledge. The artist had signed his name at the bottom, Guillaume Delisle, Royal Geographer to the King of France. This was not some provincial mapmaker working from rumors. Delisle had been among the most respected cartographers in Europe, his atlases commissioned by governments and used for diplomatic negotiations. Men like Delisle did not invent empires. They recorded them. Yet here was a state that modern history insisted had never existed, rendered in the same authoritative style as England, Spain, or the Ottoman Empire. Every line suggested certainty. Every city mark implied information received, verified, and published. Hendricks purchased the atlas for £240. The seller, an elderly woman settling her uncle's estate, mentioned that the collection had belonged to a diplomat who served in St. Petersburg during the 1790s. Many of the books and maps had been gifts or acquisitions from Russian contacts. She wrapped the atlas in brown paper without looking at it closely. 3 days later, Hendricks brought it to a specialist in antique cartography at the British Library. The specialist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had spent 30 years studying 18th century European maps, examined it in silence for nearly 20 minutes. She checked the paper composition, the ink oxidation, the binding technique, all consistent with 1756. She compared Delisle's signature to authenticated examples, genuine. Finally, she looked up at Hendricks and asked the question that would lead him into a mystery with no clear answer. Do you know how many maps from this period show Tartary exactly this way? She paused. Hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, across multiple countries, multiple languages, over 4 centuries. And yet we are told this empire never existed. Dr. Chen returned to her office and pulled down volume after volume from the reference shelves. Within an hour, Hendricks sat surrounded by evidence that refused to align with what he thought he knew about history. The first text Chen placed before him was a 1771 edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, open to the entry for Tartary. The language was not past tense. It did not describe an ancient fallen kingdom or a historical curiosity. It documented a present reality. The entry described Tartary as divided into sections: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Russian Tartary, and Tibetan Tartary. Each region received detailed attention. Independent Tartary, the text stated, was governed by its own princes and maintained considerable military forces. The geography was specific: boundaries, major cities, river systems. Population estimates appeared alongside descriptions of trade goods and regional customs. This was not legend. This was contemporary geopolitical reporting published by the most authoritative reference work in the English language. Chen produced more sources. A 1763 French atlas by Gilles Robert de Vaugondy, official geographer to King Louis XV, showed Tartary with even greater detail than Delisle's work. Trading posts were marked along what appeared to be established routes. Notations in the margins referenced distances between cities measured in lieues, the standard French unit of the period. Someone had traveled these paths. Someone had counted the miles. Dutch sources proved equally specific. A commercial handbook from 1742, intended for merchants conducting Eastern trade, contained a chapter on Tartar coinage. The text described denominations, metal content, and exchange rates with Russian rubles and Chinese currency. It warned traders about counterfeits and advised on verification methods. This was not academic speculation. These were practical instructions for men handling physical money from a functioning economic system. German encyclopedias from the 1700s told the same story. Italian maritime records referenced Tartar ports on the eastern coast. Spanish diplomatic correspondence mentioned envoys traveling through Tartar territories to reach China. Across languages, across decades, across competing European powers with no reason to coordinate such an elaborate fiction, the documentation remained consistent. Tartary existed. It had borders, cities, government, currency, and diplomatic relations. Europe knew this. Europe recorded this. Europe treated Tartary as they treated any other distant but documented state. Hendricks examined an entry from a 1740 atlas published in Amsterdam. The cartographer had included a small illustration beside the map of Tartary, a flag design. 3 horizontal stripes, the colors faded but still visible in the hand-tinted engraving. Why would a mapmaker invent a flag for a territory that supposedly never existed? Flags represented sovereignty. They were symbols of recognized political authority. The Dutch cartographer had drawn it with the same matter-of-fact precision he used for the flags of Sweden, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire. Chen showed him one final document before they broke for the evening. A 1785 Russian administrative report, written in French for European diplomats, described territorial adjustments along the empire's eastern frontier. The text mentioned negotiations with Tartar authorities over trade access and border security. It referenced specific officials by title, though the names had been partially obscured by water damage. The tone was bureaucratic, routine, the language of standard diplomatic business between neighboring states. This documentation spans 4 centuries, Chen said quietly. From the 1500s through the 1700s, you find Tartary in nearly every major European atlas, encyclopedia, and geographic reference. Then something changes. By the middle of the 1800s, it begins to disappear. Not gradually through natural evolution of knowledge, but systematically, as if someone decided this empire must be forgotten. She closed the final volume. And official history now tells us it was never real at all. Just a name. Just confusion. Despite all of this, Hendricks spent the next week in research libraries across London, following a question that seemed simple but had no satisfactory answer. The Mongol Empire, according to every accepted historical timeline, fragmented in the late 1400s. By the 1500s, it had dissolved completely into separate khanates, tribal territories, and regions absorbed by surrounding powers. The unified Mongol state was gone. This was established fact, taught in universities, repeated in textbooks, supported by archaeological evidence and primary sources. Yet here was the problem that kept Hendricks awake at night. If the Mongol Empire ended in the 1400s, what exactly were European cartographers documenting 200 years later? The atlases from the 16 and 1700s did not show scattered tribes or unnamed wilderness. They showed an organized territory called Tartary with defined borders, administrative centers, and functioning government. The time gap was impossible to ignore. Between the collapse of the Mongols and the maps of the 1700s lay 2 full centuries. The standard academic explanation, when Hendricks could find anyone willing to discuss it, was consistent but unsatisfying. Tartary was merely a catch-all term, historians insisted, a European label for the vast unknown regions of Central Asia. Cartographers used it to fill blank spaces on maps, much as they once wrote, "Here be dragons," on unexplored seas. It meant nothing specific. It represented geographical ignorance, not political reality. But this explanation disintegrated under scrutiny. Hendricks found a 1689 atlas by the Flemish cartographer Nicolaas Vischer. The map of Tartary included more than 40 named cities. Rivers were traced with precision. Mountain ranges showed accurate elevation positions. The Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, Lake Baikal, all positioned correctly in relation to Tartar territories. If this was ignorance, it was remarkably well-informed ignorance. If this was blank space-filling, why did different cartographers working in different countries agree on the placement of cities they supposedly knew nothing about? The Encyclopedia Britannica entry troubled him most. Unknown territories received vague descriptions in encyclopedias, speculative paragraphs about possible inhabitants and rumored resources. But the Tartary entry read like a government intelligence brief. It described military organization, administrative divisions, and economic systems. It used present tense verbs, is governed, maintains forces, produces trade goods. This was not how reference works discussed mythical or uncertain places. This was how they discussed France, Prussia, or Persia. Hendricks contacted a retired professor of cartographic history, a man named Dr. Malcolm Webb, who had published extensively on European map-making practices. Webb agreed to meet at a cafe near King's Cross. He arrived with a worn leather satchel containing photocopies and notes accumulated over decades. "The Tartary question," he said before Hendricks could even ask, "is the thing we are not supposed to mention in academic circles. But since I am retired and no longer concerned with tenure, I will tell you what I know." Webb spread several map reproductions across the table. "Look at these borders," he said, pointing to a 1640 French atlas. Cartographers did not draw borders casually. Borders meant sovereignty, territorial claims, diplomatic recognition. When Delisle or Vischer drew a border around Tartary, they were making a statement. This is a discrete political entity, not wilderness, not vague Asian territories. A state. He pulled out another map. Now look at how they drew unexplored regions in the Americas during the same period. Dotted lines, uncertain boundaries, notation marks indicating speculation. Tartary never received that treatment. It was drawn with the same confidence as any European nation. The professor leaned back and lowered his voice. The official position is that Europeans confused various Turkic and Mongol groups, lumped them all together under the name Tartary, and created an imaginary empire from misunderstanding. But I have examined 1,000 maps from this period. Cartographers made distinctions. They separated Ottoman territories from Persian territories from Chinese territories. They understood political boundaries. They knew the difference between established states and tribal regions. Yet they documented Tartary as established for 400 years with remarkable consistency. He paused. Either every major cartographer in Europe was simultaneously wrong in exactly the same way, or something else is happening here. Dr. Webb reached into his satchel again and produced what looked like a timeline chart, hand-drawn on yellowed graph paper. "I spent 5 years tracking this," he said. "Watch what happens." The chart showed the frequency of Tartary references in major European publications decade by decade. The line remained steady, even increasing slightly through the 1700s. Then, at the beginning of the 1800s, something changed. In 1800, Tartary still appeared on virtually every major atlas. The Encyclopedia Britannica's 3rd edition, published that year, retained its detailed entry on Tartar territories, government, and geography. French cartographers continued marking the empire's borders. German reference works described its administrative divisions. The documentation was as robust as it had been for 2 centuries. Nothing in the historical record suggested imminent change. Yet within 20 years, the references began to shrink. By 1820, subtle shifts appeared. New editions of encyclopedias shortened the Tartary entries. Some atlases still showed the borders, but the level of detail decreased. Cities previously marked by name became unlabeled dots. Notations about government and military forces disappeared from the margins. The language itself changed, from present tense descriptions of a functioning state to past tense mentions of historical geography. Cartographers began adding qualifiers, formerly known as, once called, ancient name for. The erosion accelerated through the 1830s and 1840s. Maps published in this period showed Tartary fragmenting on paper, its territory subdivided and relabeled. Russian administrative regions consumed the western portions. Chinese territorial claims expanded eastward. Independent Tartary, which earlier encyclopedias had described as governed by its own princes, vanished completely from most sources. By 1850, major reference works were redefining the term itself. Tartary was no longer a place. It was becoming a mistake. Hendricks examined copies of encyclopedia entries Webb had collected. An 1852 German lexicon explained that Tartary had been an imprecise designation used by earlier geographers for poorly understood Asian regions. An 1860 French dictionary stated the term was obsolete, replaced by more accurate geographical knowledge. An 1868 edition of Britannica reduced the entry to a single paragraph, noting that Tartary was a name formerly given to the vast regions of Central Asia. The present tense certainty of earlier editions was gone. In its place came careful distance, as if the previous documentation had been embarrassing error rather than established fact. By 1880, Tartary had nearly disappeared from serious cartography and reference works. The few mentions that remained treated it as a historical curiosity, a relic of less sophisticated times when Europeans supposedly understood little about Asia. Modern atlases showed the same geographic space divided into Russian territories, Chinese provinces, and various khanates. The borders were different, the cities had different names, and nowhere did any contemporary source acknowledge that just 80 years earlier, this same space had been confidently documented as a unified political entity. Webb tapped the chart with his finger. This is not how geographical knowledge evolves. Real corrections happen gradually, unevenly. One cartographer updates based on new surveys. Others follow slowly. Errors persist in some publications while disappearing from others. But this, he traced the sharp downward line on his graph. This is coordinated. Between 1800 and 1880, European institutions systematically removed Tartary from official knowledge. At the same time, Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia accelerated. Cities were renamed, administrative boundaries redrawn, local histories collected by Russian officials and then archived, made inaccessible. The professor pulled out one final document, a letter from 1863 written by a French geographer to a colleague in St. Petersburg. The geographer asked about accessing Russian survey records from the late 1700s for a comprehensive atlas project. The response, attached to the letter, was brief. Certain historical materials related to Eastern territories had been consolidated into state archives under restricted access. No reason given. No timeline for future availability. Just closure. Something happened in the early 19th century, Webb said quietly. Something that required the world to forget Tartary completely. Not just stop calling it by that name, but erase the fact that it had ever been documented as a functioning state. And the most troubling part? He gathered his papers slowly. They very nearly succeeded. If you ask historians today, they will tell you Tartary never existed. Just a name. Just confusion. And they believe it because the evidence of systematic erasure has itself been erased from academic memory. Hendricks began searching for something more tangible than maps and encyclopedias. If Tartary had been a real civilization erased from history, physical evidence should exist beneath the modern cities of Siberia and Central Asia. He posted requests in historical forums, contacted regional museums, and eventually received responses from 3 individuals whose accounts, while impossible to verify completely, followed a disturbing pattern. The first came from a woman named Svetlana Petrova, living in Tobolsk, a Siberian city founded by Russians in 1587. She was 78 years old, and her message was brief but precise. Her grandmother, born in 1892, had spoken often of the old cities buried beneath ours. As a child in the early 1900s, the grandmother claimed to have played in basements of homes where the foundations revealed worked stone blocks far older than the Russian settlement. The stones bore markings, not Russian letters, not recognizable script, but geometric patterns carved with clear intention. When Soviet construction crews began modernizing Tobolsk in the 1930s, the grandmother said, they uncovered passages extending deep underground. The work stopped for 3 days. Officials arrived from Moscow. Then the passages were filled with concrete, and the construction resumed as if nothing had been found. Svetlana herself remembered being 8 or 9 years old, sometime in the 1950s, when workers renovating a municipal building discovered a chamber beneath the foundation. She had been playing nearby and saw them bring up fragments, pieces of ceramic, metal objects, something that looked like part of a decorative tile. The workers talked excitedly, speculating about what lay below. Within hours, militia arrived and cordoned off the site. The next day, the opening was sealed. The workers were told the chamber contained unstable soil and posed a collapse risk. Official reports mentioned routine foundation repair and nothing more. Svetlana's grandmother had watched it all with an expression the girl never forgot. They are hiding the old cities again, the grandmother had said, just like they always do. The second testimony came from a retired surveyor named Viktor Sokolov, who had worked for Soviet geological services in Kazakhstan during the 1970s and 1980s. According to his account, sent through an intermediary who requested anonymity, he had been part of a team conducting ground surveys for industrial development near the city of Taraz. Standard procedure involved drilling core samples and mapping subsurface composition. At a site approximately 15 kilometers outside the city, the drill encountered resistance at a depth of 4 meters. When they pulled the core sample, fragments of worked stone came up with the soil. The team's supervisor ordered additional sampling in a grid pattern. More stone appeared, suggesting a structure or foundation network. Sokolov's notes, which he claimed to have kept in personal copies, indicated the stones showed evidence of precise cutting and fitting techniques. The positioning suggested planned construction, not random collapse or natural formation. He estimated the remains predated Russian presence in the region by several centuries at minimum. The team compiled a preliminary report and submitted it to the Regional Geological Administration. 3 weeks later, they received orders to cease sampling in that area and relocate to a different survey zone. Sokolov never saw his report again. Requests to access the archived survey data years later were denied. According to one official response, No such survey had been conducted in that location during that period. The third account was perhaps the most specific. A geologist named Dr. Andrei Volkov, who worked for a Soviet research institute in the 1960s, described an incident near Omsk in Siberia. A construction project for a new industrial complex required deep excavation for foundation work. At a depth of approximately 6 meters, workers broke through into what appeared to be an underground chamber. Volkov was called to assess structural stability. What he found, according to his description shared with a small group of colleagues before his death in 2008, was not a natural cave. The chamber measured roughly 8 meters across, with walls showing clear signs of construction. The stones were massive, fitted together without visible mortar. The ceiling formed a dome using a corbelling technique, layers of stone progressively overlapping until they met at the center. This was sophisticated architecture, requiring engineering knowledge and organized labor. Volkov estimated the chamber could be anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years old, possibly older. He spent less than 2 hours examining the space before ministry officials arrived and ended the inspection. The chamber was photographed, according to Volkov, though he never saw those photographs in any archive. The next day, crews filled the excavation with concrete and continued construction at a different angle, avoiding the underground structure entirely. Volkov submitted a technical report to his institute. The report was received, stamped, and filed. When he attempted to reference it in a later paper about historical Siberian settlements, he was told the document had been transferred to a restricted collection and was no longer available for citation. His requests for reconsideration were never answered. These three accounts, separated by decades and hundreds of kilometers, shared one element Hendricks could not ignore. The pattern of discovery followed immediately by silence. Hendricks obtained a list from the Russian State Library, a comparative registry of Siberian and Central Asian place names compiled by a Soviet geographer in 1932. The document had been intended as a reference for archivists dealing with historical records. It showed original names alongside their Russian replacements, with dates when changes became official. The list ran to 43 pages. Hundreds of settlements had been renamed, most between 1800 and 1920. What struck Hendricks immediately was not merely the quantity, but the timing and thoroughness. In 1800, many Siberian cities still carried names that appeared on earlier European maps of Tartary. By 1850, a wave of renaming had swept through the region. Ancient settlements with names rooted in Turkic, Mongol, or unknown linguistic origins received new Russian designations. Sometimes the changes were minor adjustments for pronunciation. Often, they were complete replacements that severed any connection to earlier identity. A city called Akhmechet became Perovsk. Orenburg briefly appeared on old maps as part of Tartar territory, then was firmly established as a Russian foundation despite archaeological evidence of much earlier settlement. The official explanation, as Hendricks found it presented in historical texts, was straightforward. This was standard colonial practice. When the Russian Empire expanded eastward, it imposed administrative order on newly acquired territories. Renaming cities reflected political control, made record-keeping more efficient, and helped integrate distant regions into the imperial structure. European powers had done the same in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. There was nothing unusual about it. This was how empires operated. But the scope suggested something beyond routine administration. Dr. Webb had shared research indicating that between 1750 and 1850, more than 300 settlements across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia underwent official name changes. Many of these cities appeared on earlier Tartary maps under their original names. By the late 1800s, those original names had been systematically removed from Russian records. Local histories, when collected by Russian ethnographers, were translated, edited, and archived in ways that emphasized Mongol and tribal heritage, while rarely mentioning any unified political structure that might resemble the Tartary described in European sources. Hendricks found an example in records from the city of Taraz in Kazakhstan. A 1742 French atlas marked a settlement in that location with a name that resembled Talus or Tarlus. Russian records from 1800 acknowledged the city existed, but described it as a recent Kazakh settlement with no significant prior history. Yet archaeological work in the 1920s, mentioned briefly in a Soviet academic journal, uncovered ruins indicating the site had been continuously inhabited for more than 1,000 years. The journal article raised questions about whose settlements these ruins represented. The next issue of the journal contained a correction stating that earlier conclusions had been premature and further study was needed. No follow-up study appeared in subsequent publications. According to one version preserved in local oral traditions and later collected by independent researchers, many renamed cities had foundation legends that did not align with Russian accounts. Elders in some communities spoke of ancestors who had lived in those places for generations before Russian arrival, under different political structures and using names that linked to older trade routes and forgotten kingdoms. When Soviet ethnographers recorded these stories in the early 1900s, the versions that entered official archives often differed from what informants reportedly said. References to old empires or the time before the Russians were softened into generic mentions of nomadic heritage. The pattern extended to maps themselves. Russian cartographers in the 1800s created new surveys of Siberian and Central Asian territories. These maps showed contemporary Russian administrative divisions and renamed cities. When archived, they were filed as authoritative geographical records. Earlier maps, including Russian maps from the 1700s that had shown many of the same regions labeled as Tartar territories, were moved to historical collections. Over time, the earlier maps became curiosities, examples of outdated knowledge rather than documentation of a different political reality. The administrative present erased the documented past. Hendricks discovered one particularly telling detail in the records of the Russian Geographical Society. In 1845, the Society launched a project to collect and standardize place names across the empire's eastern territories. Teams of officials traveled to remote cities, interviewed local authorities, and compiled lists of current names along with any historical variants they could identify. The completed reports filled dozens of volumes. But when Hendricks tried to access these volumes through a research library, he learned they had been transferred to restricted sections of the Russian state archives in the 1930s. Permission to view them required approval from federal authorities, justification of research purpose, and review periods that could extend for years. Why would 19th century place name surveys require restricted access more than a century later? According to archivists, the restriction was routine for materials that might contain sensitive ethnographic information about minority populations. But the blanket classification seemed excessive. Hendricks spoke with a Russian archivist through an encrypted email exchange. The archivist declined to be named. Some of these records, the archivist wrote, contain descriptions of cities that do not match the official timeline of Russian settlement. Buildings too old, infrastructure too developed, place names that connect to map-making traditions we are told were errors. If you believe such records might complicate established historical narratives, you might decide they should not be easily accessible. Deep in the Altai Mountains, approximately 300 kilometers from the nearest city, stands a stone structure that has troubled archaeologists since its documentation in 1974. The walls rise nearly 8 meters high, constructed from granite blocks weighing an estimated 2 to 3 tons each. The blocks fit together with precision joints requiring no mortar. The structure follows an orientation aligned to cardinal directions within less than 1 degree of accuracy. According to official settlement records, this region received its first permanent Russian inhabitants in the late 1800s. The stone structure, based on weathering analysis and limited carbon dating of organic material found in mortar traces, appears to be at least 500 years older. A Soviet archaeological team studied the site for 6 weeks in 1975. Their preliminary report, portions of which later circulated among academics, described the construction technique as inconsistent with known nomadic building practices. The precision cutting, the massive stone transportation, the surveyed alignment, all suggested organized labor, engineering knowledge, and resource coordination associated with settled civilizations. The team requested additional funding for comprehensive excavation. The request was denied. The site was classified as a regional historical monument with restricted access, and no further studies were authorized. Similar anomalies appear across Siberia and Central Asia. In Omsk, construction workers in 2003 uncovered a network of underground passages while excavating for a shopping center foundation. The passages were brick-lined, approximately 2 meters high, and extended in multiple directions beneath the city center. Initial examinations suggested the brickwork predated the city's official founding in 1716. Engineers brought in to assess structural stability noted that the passage construction showed sophisticated drainage design and ventilation shafts. Local historians speculated about medieval trade tunnels, though no records mention such infrastructure. The passages were mapped, photographed, and then sealed with concrete. The shopping center was built on schedule. Official reports described routine foundation work with no significant discoveries. Near Tobolsk, a geologist conducting soil surveys for a pipeline project in 1998 detected ground-penetrating radar anomalies indicating subsurface structures in a grid pattern. The spacing and regularities suggested planned construction rather than natural formation. The geologist submitted his findings with a request for archaeological assessment before pipeline installation. Regional authorities reviewed the request and determined that the radar readings were inconclusive, possibly indicating natural rock formations or medieval settlement remains of no historical significance. The pipeline route was approved without modification. The geologist, Dr.
Mikhail Fedorov later told colleagues that his raw survey data had been confiscated as part of routine regulatory review and never returned. Artifacts present their own contradictions. A ceramic fragment recovered from a construction site in Novosibirsk in 2007 was sent to a laboratory for dating analysis. The results indicated the material was approximately 800 years old, placing its creation in the 1300s. The fragment showed decorative patterns unlike known Mongol, Chinese, or Russian pottery styles of that period. The archaeologist who submitted the sample requested funding to search for additional artifacts at the site. The funding was allocated, then frozen due to administrative restructuring. By the time budgets were restored 2 years later, the construction site had been completed and paved over. A pattern emerges from these incidents. Physical evidence surfaces during routine construction, geological surveys, or accidental discoveries. Initial examination reveals anomalies, structures too old, techniques too sophisticated, artifacts that do not fit established timelines. Researchers submit reports and request further investigation. Then administrative mechanisms engage. Access becomes restricted. Funding delays occur. Sites are sealed, built over, or classified. Published studies are shortened, conclusions softened, or follow-up research never materialized. The evidence does not disappear entirely, but it becomes inaccessible, fragmented, scattered across restricted archives and incomplete reports. Dr. Webb had collected documentation of 17 such cases between 1970 and 2010. Each involved discoveries beneath Siberian or Central Asian cities that suggested earlier, more developed settlement than official history acknowledged. Each followed similar bureaucratic resolution. "The most effective way to hide something," Webb told Hendricks during their final meeting, "is not to destroy it completely, but to make it difficult to access, easy to dismiss, and impossible to study comprehensively. Keep each discovery isolated. Prevent researchers from connecting patterns. Ensure that anyone who tries to assemble the full picture appears to be constructing conspiracy rather than documenting evidence." The most recent case Webb had documented occurred in 2015. A team renovating a historical museum in Barnaul discovered a sealed room behind a basement wall. The room contained wooden storage crates marked with dates from the 1890s. Inside were archaeological artifacts, stone tools, metal implements, fragments of decorative items, all catalogued with locations across southern Siberia. The catalog entries indicated the items had been collected during surveys in the late 19th century, then stored and apparently forgotten. Some artifacts had notes estimating ages that predated Russian expansion by centuries. The museum director reported the discovery and requested academic assessment. Authorities arrived, removed the crates, and stated the materials would be transferred to central archives for proper preservation. The museum received a receipt. The crates never appeared in any public archive catalog. Hendricks made an appointment with the British Museum's Department of Asian Collections. He came prepared with a list of references he had compiled from 19th century sources. Letters, diplomatic correspondence, and museum acquisition records that mentioned Tartar artifacts. The curator who met with him, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, listened politely to his inquiry and then delivered what appeared to be a practiced response.
The museum had never held a significant collection of Tartar artifacts, she explained.
There may have been occasional items from Central Asian regions that early catalogers labeled with imprecise geographic designations, but nothing specifically identified as coming from a state called Tartary. The term itself was antiquated and geographically meaningless. If Hendricks had seen references to such items in old documents, those references likely described objects that were later properly reclassified under correct cultural and geographic origins: Mongol, Chinese, Turkic, or Russian. But Hendricks had found something specific: an 1827 acquisition ledger, preserved in the museum's own archives, listed a donation from Sir Robert Wilson, a British military officer who had served in Russia during the Napoleonic period. The entry described artifacts of Tartar origin, including ceremonial items, coins, and manuscript fragments. The donation was recorded with an acquisition number and a notation indicating the items had been placed in the Oriental collections. Hendricks showed Dr. Thornton a photocopy of the ledger page. She examined it carefully, then consulted her computer database. After several minutes of searching, she reported that she could find no items currently in the collection matching that acquisition number. It was possible, she suggested, that the objects had been deaccessioned in the 19th century, a common practice when items were deemed duplicates or of insufficient historical value. Alternatively, they might have been destroyed during World War II, when the museum moved portions of its collection to secure storage and some materials were lost or damaged. Without more specific information about the objects themselves, she could not trace their current location. Hendricks pressed further. Were there records of deaccession decisions? Archives of wartime losses? Any documentation explaining what happened to items from that acquisition? Dr. Thornton's response was measured but final.
Records from that period were incomplete. The museum had undergone numerous reorganizations, especially during the Victorian era when collection practices were systematized. Many early acquisition details were not preserved. She could submit a formal research inquiry on his behalf, but she cautioned that it might take months and was unlikely to yield results for items acquired 200 years ago that no longer appeared in current catalogs. Before leaving, Hendricks spoke with a museum librarian who had worked there for 30 years. The conversation was brief and took place in the hallway, away from official offices. According to the librarian, who requested anonymity, there had been persistent rumors among older staff members about a ghost collection in deep storage. Items cataloged in the 19th century but never transferred to modern databases. These objects supposedly remained in basement archives in their original Victorian-era organization, untouched and largely forgotten. Access to those storage areas required special permission and was rarely granted, even to internal researchers. The librarian had never personally seen evidence of Tartar artifacts, but she had heard stories from a predecessor who claimed to have glimpsed wooden crates labeled with geographic terms no longer used in museum categorization. Hendricks found similar patterns at other institutions. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris held manuscript records mentioning Tartar documents received from diplomatic sources in the early 1800s. Current archivists could not locate these documents in the collection. The Royal Geographical Society in London had notes from an 1835 presentation describing Tartar coins analyzed by a member who had traveled through Central Asia. The coins themselves were not in the Society's current holdings.
The German Museum in Berlin had a catalog entry from 1842 listing ceremonial objects identified as Tartar in origin. The objects were recorded as destroyed during World War II, though no photographs or detailed descriptions had survived. A researcher Hendricks contacted through academic channels, a historian specializing in Victorian museum practices who declined to be named, suggested a possibility. In the mid to late 1800s, as Tartary was being redefined from a geographic place to a historical error, museums may have quietly reclassified or removed items associated with the term. Objects labeled Tartar might be reattributed to known cultures. Items that couldn't be easily reclassified might be moved to storage, their ambiguous origins making them unsuitable for public display. Over time, these objects would become administratively invisible, present in physical collections but absent from searchable records. Museums are reluctant to acknowledge lost or misplaced items, the researcher wrote in an encrypted message. It suggests poor stewardship. If you have artifacts that raise uncomfortable questions about your institution's historical narrative, the easiest solution is not to destroy them, which would be unethical and might be discovered, but simply to make them bureaucratically inaccessible. Keep them in storage. Require excessive permissions to view them. Ensure that accessing the items is so difficult that researchers give up. Eventually, institutional memory fades, and the objects become effectively non-existent without anyone having made an explicit decision to hide them. Hendricks contacted 12 academic historians specializing in Central Asian history, Russian expansion, or early modern cartography. 9 replied. 7 of those 9 dismissed the Tartary question in nearly identical language. It was a cartographic error, they explained, a catch-all term Europeans used for poorly understood regions.
The issue had been settled decades ago. Pursuing it further would be unproductive. 2 historians did not reply directly, but their assistants sent polite messages suggesting the professors were too busy to discuss fringe historical topics. The remaining 2 responses were different. The first came from Dr. James Mitchell, a British historian who had spent 40 years studying Russian imperial expansion. He agreed to speak by phone if Hendricks promised not to record or directly quote him in any public forum. During their conversation, Mitchell spoke carefully. The academic consensus on Tartary is that it never existed as a unified state, he said. But if you examine the evidence privately, away from departmental politics and tenure considerations, you encounter a problem that does not have a satisfying resolution. Mitchell explained that early in his career, he had noticed the contradiction between European documentation and accepted historical narrative. He had raised questions during a conference presentation in the 1980s. The response from senior colleagues was swift and clear. Pursuing the Tartary question was career suicide. It marked you as someone who entertained conspiracy theories, someone who lacked proper historical rigor. The mechanism is subtle, Mitchell said. No one forbids you from researching it, but papers on the topic get rejected from journals. Grant proposals receive low priority. Colleagues begin treating you as less serious. Eventually, you learn to focus on safer questions. He acknowledged the evidence Hendricks had compiled. the consistency across sources, the authoritative nature of the documentation, the systematic timeline of erasure. These facts are not in dispute, Mitchell said. What is in dispute is the interpretation.
The accepted explanation is that Europeans collectively misunderstood Central Asian geography and politics, creating a phantom empire from fragments of real information about various Turkic and Mongol groups. This misunderstanding persisted for centuries because cartographers copied from each other rather than conducting independent verification. He paused. But I have examined the evidence. The consistency is remarkable. The details are too specific, and the erasure in the 1800s was too coordinated to be simple intellectual correction. The second substantive response came from Dr. Natalia Kozlov, a Russian historian teaching at a university in Estonia. She agreed to exchange encrypted emails. Her first message was blunt. You are researching something that cannot be openly discussed in mainstream academic circles. If you publish anything on this topic, you will be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. But since you have already gone this far, I will tell you what I know. Kozlov had encountered the Tartary question while researching Russian archival practices in the 19th century. She found patterns in how materials were classified, restricted, and occasionally disappeared. The Russian Empire conducted extensive surveys of newly acquired Siberian and Central Asian territories, she wrote. These surveys documented existing settlements, infrastructure, and local governance structures. Many survey reports from the late 1700s and early 1800s are now classified or missing. The ones that remain accessible have been edited. You can sometimes see where pages were removed or entries redacted. Why would routine geographic surveys require such treatment? She pointed to a specific case. In 1815, a Russian military officer named Colonel Pavel Menkov submitted a detailed report about administrative structures he encountered in territories east of the Urals. The report, portions of which Kozlov had seen in restricted archives, described organized governance systems, trade networks, and infrastructure that predated Russian arrival. Menkov expressed confusion about how to integrate these structures into Russian administration, since they appeared more developed than expected for supposedly primitive tribal regions. His report was filed, and Menkov received orders to cease making such observations in official documents. Later summaries of his work omitted these details entirely. The standard academic position, Kozlov continued, is that such reports reflect Russian officers misunderstanding local tribal confederations or exaggerating findings to justify larger budgets and more military resources. But read enough of these reports and a different picture emerges. These officers were describing something real, something organized, something that did not fit the narrative of Russian expansion into wilderness. And at some point, probably in the mid-1800s, a decision was made that such descriptions were problematic. She concluded with a warning. A few historians know this evidence exists. We do not discuss it openly because doing so means professional marginalization. The academic community has created a consensus that Tartary was cartographic error, and challenging that consensus requires more evidence than currently accessible. The evidence that might prove the case is locked in archives, sealed in storage, or has been deliberately made unavailable. This creates an impossible situation. You cannot prove what you cannot access, and you cannot access
what might prove your case. Hendricks found one additional source, a retired archaeology professor in Kazakhstan who had published extensively in Soviet journals during the 1970s and 1980s. The professor, Dr.
Askar Nuriev responded to Hendricks's inquiry with a single-paragraph email. I spent my career excavating sites across Kazakhstan. I found many things that did not fit official chronologies. I learned to describe my findings in ways that avoided difficult questions. This is how Soviet academia functioned, and this is how it still functions. If you want to understand what Tartary might have been, do not ask historians. Ask the ground. Physical evidence cannot be argued with, but first, you must be allowed to dig. Among the various interpretations of Tartary's disappearance, one stands apart as the most controversial and the most difficult to discuss in academic settings. According to some independent researchers examining 19th century photographs and architectural evidence, something catastrophic occurred in the early 1800s, an event that physically destroyed cities across a vast region and required massive reconstruction efforts that have since been attributed to normal urban development. This interpretation, sometimes called the mud flood theory, suggests that Tartary did not simply fade from maps through political absorption, but was buried, both literally and figuratively, after a civilization-ending disaster. The evidence cited begins with photographs. Researchers point to images from the mid to late 1800s showing buildings across Russia, Europe, and North America with unusual features. Windows that appear to be half buried, with their lower portions below street level. Doors accessed by descending stairs rather than ascending them. Ground floors that seem to function as basements, with architectural details suggesting they were once above ground. In many photographs, the transition between buried lower levels and current street level is visible. A clear line where older masonry meets newer construction or added soil. Proponents of this theory compile these images systematically. A photograph from 1870 showing a building in St. Petersburg with ornate windows half submerged below the street. An 1880 image from Kazan revealing decorative stonework that appears to continue beneath ground level. Pictures from cities across Siberia displaying similar patterns, elaborate architecture partially buried, accessed through excavated stairwells, with the buried portions showing no signs of being designed as basements. The photographs are genuine historical documents. Their interpretation is what remains contentious. According to this interpretation, sometime in the early 1800s, a catastrophic event buried cities across a massive geographic area under layers of mud, soil, or debris. The event's nature remains speculative. Volcanic activity, flooding, earthquake-triggered landslides, or something else entirely. What matters to the theory is the aftermath. Survivors emerged to find their cities partially buried, infrastructure destroyed, and populations decimated. The reconstruction that followed was attributed to normal urban development, expansion, and modernization. The buried lower floors became basements. The event itself was never officially recorded as a singular catastrophe, but rather absorbed into local histories as floods, fires, or gradual changes in street elevation. This theory connects to Tartary through timing. If such a catastrophe occurred in the early 1800s,
It would coincide precisely with Tartary's disappearance from maps and records. The civilization that European sources had documented for centuries would have been physically destroyed. The subsequent reconstruction, led by Russian expansion and Western influence, would have imposed new political structures, new names, and new histories on the devastated regions. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have been unable to maintain their previous political identity.
Within the generation, Tartary would exist only in memory, and within 2 generations, even the memory would fade. Most historians dismiss this interpretation as fantasy. The photographic evidence, they argue, shows normal architectural features of the period. Basement windows were common. Street levels changed over time due to road improvements, sewer installation, and flood prevention measures. Buildings were constructed with lower floors designed for storage or service functions. The appearance of burial is an illusion created by selective photography and misunderstanding of 19th century urban development. No geological evidence supports a catastrophic mud deposition event across such a vast area. No contemporary accounts describe such a disaster. The theory requires ignoring established timelines and inventing events for which no credible documentation exists. Yet the photographs persist. Researchers continue to find images that seem difficult to explain through standard architectural history. A building in Tobolsk with 3 visible floors above ground and ornate archways half buried below street level, their decorative details suggesting they were meant to be seen. Churches across Siberia with foundations descending far deeper than structural necessity would require, accessed through excavated passages that reveal multiple levels of buried architecture. City plans from the late 1700s compared with photographs from the late 1800s showing dramatic changes in street elevation that official records attribute only to gradual improvement projects. One researcher, an engineer named Robert Schock, who examined these images in the early 2000s, attempted to calculate the volume of material that would need to be added to explain the elevation changes visible in historical photographs of certain Siberian cities. His rough estimates suggested millions of cubic meters of soil, far exceeding what typical urban development projects would require or produce. When he published his observations in an independent forum, academic responses ranged from dismissal to accusations of promoting pseudoscience. No mainstream journal would review his calculations. The photographs he cited were not disputed as authentic, but their interpretation was deemed beyond credible consideration. The mud flood theory remains on the fringe of historical discussion, mentioned primarily as an example of how conspiracy thinking can misinterpret mundane evidence. But it raises a question that even skeptics struggle to answer completely. If these architectural features are simply normal basement construction and street elevation changes, why do they appear so consistently across such a vast geographic area during precisely the period when Tartary disappeared from official knowledge? Hendricks began submitting formal research requests to archives across Russia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. He wanted access to specific categories of documents: Russian imperial survey reports from 1750 to 1820, cartographic records showing territorial designations before standardization, and ethnographic materials collected during early Russian expansion. The responses followed a pattern so consistent it seemed almost coordinated, though no evidence of coordination existed. The Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts in Moscow held extensive collections from the imperial period.
Hendricks requested access to geographical survey materials from Siberian territories dated between 1770 and 1820. The archive responded that such materials existed, but were classified under federal restrictions related to historical border demarcation issues. Access required approval from the Ministry of Culture, justification of academic need, and sponsorship from a recognized Russian research institution. As a private researcher, Hendricks could not meet these requirements. His appeal was acknowledged and denied within 3 weeks. He tried approaching the problem differently. Several Russian regional archives held local historical collections, often less restricted than central repositories. Hendricks contacted archives in Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Tomsk, requesting access to 19th century city planning documents and construction records. These materials should have been routine historical sources. 2 archives responded that their pre-1850 collections had been transferred to state custody during Soviet-era consolidation and were no longer held locally. The 3rd archive, in Tomsk, confirmed they held some relevant materials but required in-person research visits. Foreign researchers needed special permits issued by federal authorities. Processing time was estimated at 6 to 12 months. Archives in Kazakhstan presented similar obstacles. The Central State Archive in Almaty held materials from the Tsarist period, including reports from Russian military officers and administrators in the 19th century. Hendricks requested permission to examine documents related to pre-existing settlements and infrastructure discovered during Russian territorial surveys. The archive required letters of introduction from accredited academic institutions, detailed research proposals explaining the purpose and methodology, and approval from Kazakhstan's Committee on Archives and Documentation. The approval process, according to the archive's website, could take up to 18 months with no guarantee of access even if all requirements were met. He found one elderly archivist in Almaty willing to speak anonymously through an intermediary. According to this source, certain collections in Kazakh state archives contained reports from the 1800s describing discoveries that complicated official narratives of Russian expansion into empty or primitive territories. These reports mentioned established cities, functional infrastructure, and organized governance systems encountered by Russian officials. During the Soviet period, these materials were designated as sensitive for reasons never clearly articulated. The classification remained in place decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. Researchers who specifically requested these documents often received responses claiming the materials were undergoing preservation treatment, had been transferred to other facilities, or could not be located in current catalogs. Ottoman archives in Istanbul offered another potential source. If Tartary had existed as a functioning state, Ottoman diplomatic records might contain references to trade, territorial disputes, or diplomatic contact. Hendricks worked through a Turkish colleague to submit research inquiries. The response indicated that Ottoman records related to Eastern territories and Central Asian affairs from the 17 and 1800s were organized in collections requiring special permission. Many had not been digitized. Access required demonstrating specific academic credentials, institutional affiliation, and research projects with clearly defined historical questions. Independent research into vague geographic entities like Tartary did not meet these criteria. Persian archives presented an even more complex situation. After the Iranian Revolution, access to historical archives became severely restricted for foreign researchers. Materials from the Safavid and Qajar periods that might contain references to territories northeast of Persia remained largely inaccessible to Western scholars. Hendricks contacted an Iranian historian living in exile who had worked in Tehran archives before 1979. The historian recalled seeing administrative documents mentioning Tartar territories in correspondence about trade routes and border security. He had not studied these references in detail at the time.
Returning to examine them now would be impossible without regime approval, which was unlikely for research into topics with no clear benefit to current Iranian political interests. Even within Europe, certain archives proved difficult to access. Hendricks learned that some French diplomatic correspondence from the 17 and 1800s, particularly materials related to Russian affairs and Asian trade, remained in restricted collections at the French Foreign Ministry archives. Standard academic access procedures existed, but processing times were long and approval was not guaranteed. A French historian Hendricks contacted through email explained that diplomatic archives often contained sensitive materials about historical relationships between nations. Even correspondence centuries old could be restricted if it touched on border disputes, territorial claims, or international agreements that retained contemporary political relevance. The pattern became clear. Documents that might provide direct evidence about Tartary's nature, extent, and disappearance existed in various archives. But accessing them required navigating bureaucratic systems designed to restrict access. Classifications persisted decades or centuries beyond any plausible security justification. Processing times extended for months or years. Requirements for approval created barriers that effectively excluded independent researchers. When access was granted, materials were often heavily redacted, partially available, or presented in ways that limited comprehensive analysis. Hendricks compiled his findings into a document showing where relevant historical materials should exist, based on standard archival practices and catalog records, and where access was restricted or denied. The gaps followed precise boundaries. Pre-1800 materials from Siberian and Central Asian territories, restricted. Russian survey reports from the period of Tartary's disappearance, classified. Ottoman and Persian diplomatic records from the same period and region, inaccessible. Ethnographic collections from the early 1800s, transferred to closed state archives. Modern satellite technology offers a view that 19th century cartographers could never have imagined. High-resolution imaging systems can penetrate vegetation, detect variations in soil density, and reveal patterns invisible from ground level. In 2018, a team of independent researchers analyzing publicly available satellite data of southern Siberia noticed something unusual. Beneath the surface, in regions where no major settlements officially existed before Russian colonization, geometric patterns appeared, regular grids, linear formations suggesting roads or pathways, rectangular outlines that resembled city layouts. The patterns were not definitive proof of anything. Soil variations can create geometric appearances. Agricultural activity leaves traces. Natural geological formations sometimes produce regular shapes. But the researchers noted that these particular patterns appeared in locations that matched cities marked on old Tartary maps. The correspondence was not exact, but it was suggestive. Modern Omsk overlay with older geometric traces beneath it. Tobolsk showed subsurface patterns extending beyond current city boundaries. Regions labeled on 1700s atlases as Tartar territory displayed grid formations beneath empty steppe. The researchers attempted to publish their findings in academic journals. Reviewers rejected the papers, citing insufficient evidence and overly speculative interpretation. One reviewer's comments, later leaked online, stated bluntly that connecting satellite imagery to discredited historical theories about Tartary was not serious scholarship. The researchers released their data independently through online forums.
It generated discussion among alternative history communities, but gained no traction in mainstream academic discourse. Satellite data, like photographs and documents before it, could be observed but not officially acknowledged. In 2012, a German researcher named Klaus Weber announced he had discovered definitive documentary evidence proving Tartary's existence as a functioning state. Weber claimed to have obtained copies of Russian archival materials through a contact in Moscow, materials that included administrative correspondence, trade records, and diplomatic reports from the late 1700s explicitly describing interactions with Tartar political authorities. He promised to publish the documents with full analysis within 6 months. Then, 3 months later, Weber issued a retraction. He stated that upon further review, the documents were mistranslations or misattributed materials that did not support his initial claims. He apologized for the premature announcement and withdrew from all public discussion of Tartary. Colleagues who knew Weber described the retraction as uncharacteristic. He had been a meticulous researcher, careful about source verification. The sudden reversal seemed inconsistent with his methods. Some speculated he had been pressured legally or professionally. Others suggested he realized his error and chose to correct it quietly. Weber himself refused all interview requests. He continued working in historical research, but never mentioned Tartary again. The documents he had claimed to possess never appeared publicly. Whatever he had found, or thought he had found, disappeared with his silence. This pattern of near revelations followed by retreat appears throughout Tartary research. Evidence surfaces, claims are made, then everything dissolves into retraction or silence. Each incident leaves questions but provides no answers. Each researcher who pursues the topic too aggressively eventually steps back, either through academic pressure, bureaucratic obstacles, or unexplained personal decisions. The mystery perpetuates itself through accumulated absences, absent documents, absent access, absent explanations. Hendricks spent 3 years following the evidence as far as accessible sources allowed. He compiled maps, testimonies, photographs, and archival references. The material filled 2 file cabinets in his London flat. He knew what official history stated. Tartary was a cartographic error, a name Europeans used for regions they did not understand, nothing more. But he also knew what the evidence showed. Centuries of consistent documentation describing a defined political entity, followed by systematic erasure during a specific period, followed by bureaucratic barriers preventing comprehensive investigation. 2 possibilities remained, neither fully provable with available evidence. First, that Tartary was indeed a collective European misunderstanding, and the erasure was simply intellectual correction carried out enthusiastically across multiple nations and institutions simultaneously. Second, that Tartary was real, Something happened to destroy or dissolve it in the early 1800s, and powerful interests decided the world must forget it existed.
If the first possibility was true, why did the erasure need to be so thorough? Why did archives remain restricted? Why did researchers encounter such consistent resistance? If the second possibility was true, who made the decision to erase an empire from history? And why would that decision still matter enough to maintain secrecy 2 centuries later? The central question persists. If Tartary was merely a meaningless geographic term, a mistake corrected by better knowledge, why does investigating it still feel like pulling at threads someone does not want unraveled? If this story has troubled you with questions that have no easy answers, there are others. Other mysteries buried beneath official narratives, other places where history seems to have been carefully edited, other moments when the evidence and the explanation do not align. Watch the other videos on this channel to see what else has been hidden in plain sight, documented but dismissed, present in records but absent from memory. Write your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe happened to Tartary? And if this story made you question what you thought you knew about history, press the like button to help others find these questions too.